Wait, you were in row 17. You mean you're the one who landed that plane? She didn't answer. Just lowered her hood and kept walking across the tarmac like she'd done it 100 times before. No cameras, no press conference. Just 138 people alive because of someone the crew hadn't even noticed when she boarded. This isn't a story about fame. It's a story about what happens when everything fails and the quietest person on board takes the controls. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Flight 704 had taken off from Salt Lake City International just after sunrise. A calm spring morning, clear skies, smooth air, the kind of flight where passengers let their shoulders drop, check their phones once, and then forget the world for a while. It was bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, just under 3 hours across the Rockies and the Great Plains. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-800 operated by Pacific Meridian Airlines, was nearly full. A business crowd, some vacationers, a few families with kids still clutching plush animals. Gate agents had cleared 138 passengers and 5 crew. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Everything hummed with routine. Seat 17A, window side, held a passenger no one noticed. Ellie Marchand, 27, had boarded quietly during the final call. She carried a small canvas bag, wore a navy fleece that covered her frame, and slipped into her seat with practiced discretion. Noise-canceling headphones shielded her ears. Her eyes, half closed, gave off the impression of either deep rest or deep thought. To fellow passengers, she looked like a solo traveler, maybe a grad student, maybe just someone who didn't care for conversation. Her dark hair was tied back in a low braid. Her sweatshirt bore the faded crest of a public university in Maine. Her sneakers were worn but clean. There was no phone in her hand, no smartwatch glowing, no idle scrolling. She didn't draw attention, and that was by design. It had been 15 months since Ellie had left the Air National Guard. Before that, she had served 5 years with the 187th Airlift Squadron as a C-130 Hercules flight instructor, specializing in multi-engine emergencies and night descent under blackout conditions. She had never once posted a photo in uniform, not even on the day she left. But the FAA had quietly kept her name. A confidential directive issued 6 months earlier had flagged her for emergency override status under a little-known protocol called TAC-12, a contingency registry that linked certified veteran pilots with certain domestic flights during specific windows. The program wasn't public. Not even the cabin crew knew who was on the list, but the FAA did. So did Colonel Grant Halverson, who had co-authored the protocol after a commercial near miss 2 years ago. Ellie was among only 7 civilians in the system granted instant authority in the event of total crew incapacitation. That authority could be activated remotely if 3 conditions were met: loss of cockpit control, communication blackout, and aircraft in distress. At minute 51 of Flight 704, the first condition quietly activated. It began as a metallic snap under the floor of the aircraft, somewhere aft of the right wing. Most passengers didn't hear it, just a subtle ping that disappeared beneath the rustle of snack wrappers and the soft hum of recirculated air. But Ellie heard it. More precisely, she felt it. She sat forward slightly, removed one headphone, and placed her fingers against the window frame. Another vibration followed, low and irregular, like a gear-resisting movement. She reached slowly for her seatbelt and clicked it tighter. Across the aisle, a teenage boy glanced at her with curiosity. She didn't return the look. Her focus was already ahead. Then came the first jolt. The plane shuddered violently as the starboard engine dropped RPM without warning. A whine rose, then cut out completely. The cabin lights flickered. An overhead bin popped open near row 20, spilling a diaper bag onto a passenger's lap. Panic hadn't begun yet, but it was in the air. 10 seconds later, the port engine sputtered. This time, the noise was unmistakable, a choking, grinding cough followed by silence. The aircraft tilted slightly left and began losing altitude fast. Oxygen masks dropped. Children screamed. A woman near the front vomited into her purse. The PA system crackled, then blurted a sharp tone. A voice followed, strained, male, barely composed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are currently experiencing a complete power loss. Please remain calm and secure your seatbelts. Emergency protocols are in progress. Then the system cut out entirely. In the forward galley, lead flight attendant Linda Corbin released her harness and ran down the aisle, gripping seatbacks for balance as the plane descended. She didn't look toward the cockpit. She headed straight for row 17. Her face was pale but focused. She passed panicking passengers, stepped over a tray cart that had broken loose. As she reached the row, she didn't hesitate. "You," she shouted, pointing at 17A, window seat. "Now." Ellie was already rising. A man in 17C, a sales manager from Atlanta, stared at her, bewildered. "Her," he barked. "You're bringing her to the cockpit. She probably thinks that's where they film TikToks." Someone behind him laughed, nervously. "That's your backup pilot. She's not even 30. Linda didn't answer them. Ellie handed her carry-on to the man without looking at him. He flinched, unsure what to do with it. Without a word, she stepped into the aisle, nodding once to Linda. The aircraft dipped again, and she gripped the overhead bin to steady herself. Then she walked forward, deliberate, unfazed. One of the flight attendants opened the cockpit door without keying a code. The internal lock had failed when the secondary electrical bus went offline. The inside smelled of burnt plastic and metal. First Officer Troy Bennett was unconscious, slumped in his chair. His oxygen mask hung loose around his neck. Captain Dean Rourke was still conscious but fading. His hands trembled on the yoke, lips bluish, sweat pouring down his collar. Ellie didn't pause. She stepped inside, reached for the autopilot override lever, and pulled. The yoke snapped back with force. The plane jerked upward slightly, but enough to stop the nose-down plunge. Captain Rourke blinked at her, confused. "Who the hell?" he managed. Ellie's voice was calm but urgent. "Ellie Marchand, civilian override, TAC 12 authorization. You're hypoxic and losing fine motor. Keep your eyes open. I'll get the rat deployed." She flipped two switches, scanned the dead screens, then reached beneath the panel to manually release the ram air turbine. A hollow thump echoed through the aircraft's belly as the small prop deployed from beneath the fuselage, restoring minimal power to critical avionics and hydraulics. Back in the cabin, Linda stood silently near row 6, watching the door. The other attendants looked at her, uncertain. "She's not a passenger," Linda finally said. "She's the reason we're not crashing yet." In the FAA Emergency Operations Hub in Atlanta, a terminal lit up with a new flag, Flight 704, pilot incapacitation confirmed, Shunner's TAC 12 override candidate activated, and operator picked up the red phone. Colonel Halverson was in the middle of a briefing when it rang. He didn't hesitate. "This is Halverson. Sir, we have a TAC 12 activation. Flight 704, Marchand is on board." He didn't ask what happened. He simply gave the order. "Patch me through to Wilmington Tower. Now." Back on Flight 704, Ellie was already adjusting trim controls, compensating for aerodynamic drag. The plane was gliding barely, but it was enough. She had control. A moment later, the co-pilot groaned, still out cold. Captain Rourke blinked again. "You military I was," she said, not looking at him. "Right now, I just need you to breathe." Then she reached for the radio, thumbed the mic, and calmly said into the static Wilmington Tower, "This is Ellie Marchand, assuming emergency command of Pacific Meridian Flight 704. Both flight crew incapacitated. Dual engine failure. We have 138 souls on board, requesting immediate emergency vectors for powerless landing. In the control tower in Wilmington, North Carolina, 3 operators froze. Then one of them whispered, "She's not on the crew manifest." Another voice, strong, commanding, came through their headset seconds later. "This is Colonel Grant Halverson. Confirm identity. That woman is authorized. Give her whatever she needs." Flight 704 was no longer falling. It was gliding toward a fight for survival. But now, someone was at the controls. Someone who had been there before. And for the first time since the power failed, the plane flew steady. The cockpit smelled of burned plastic and stale sweat. Ellie moved quickly, but nothing about her felt rushed. The first thing she noticed was the complete blackout of the primary navigation panel. The second was the silence, no hum, no engine vibration, only the whisper of rushing air past the fuselage. First Officer Bennett was unconscious. His head had slumped to the side, oxygen mask limp against his shoulder. Ellie checked his pulse without speaking, noted it was steady, then reached across him to flip 2 breaker switches near his armrest. The system didn't respond. Captain Dean Rourke was still awake, barely. His knuckles were white against the yoke. He was breathing in gas, jaw clenched, eyes blinking like he wasn't sure if what he was seeing was real. He didn't resist when Ellie placed a hand on the column and said, calmly, "Let go." "Captain, I've got it." His fingers slowly released. Ellie pulled back gently, adjusting the pitch angle. The plane wasn't tumbling, but it had been drifting nose down. She kept it level, using trim control manually. The elevators responded sluggishly, but they responded. That meant hydraulics were alive, if just barely. She reached for the override console and killed the stuck emergency autopilot. The system had locked into a failed loop, likely trying to climb while the engines had already flamed out. Once disabled, the yoke became lighter in her hands. Then she did something only a few pilots would have remembered. She reached under the main panel, felt for the old mechanical release, and deployed the ram air turbine. A small propeller beneath the fuselage dropped into the slipstream, converting airflow into enough electrical power to support minimal avionics and hydraulics. Seconds later, one screen flickered back to life, just enough to show altitude and attitude. The captain stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, voice dry and rattled. Ellie didn't look up. Her eyes were scanning dials. "Ellie Marchand, former C-130 instructor, 187th Airlift. I'm currently a simulation lead at the FAA's Joint Training Center. I teach advanced multi-engine failure scenarios for Boeing aircraft. You? What I've practiced this over 200 times. You've done it once in the simulator. Maybe just breathe normally and read the backup checklist for me when I ask." Captain Rourke coughed into his sleeve. "You're not on the crew manifest." "No," she said, "but the FAA has me tagged as TAC 12 fallback on selected domestic flights. They should be pinging your transponder now." She didn't expect him to understand that. Most pilots didn't even know the TAC 12 registry existed, but Colonel Halverson did, and he would act soon if he hadn't already. Behind her, the door opened slightly. Linda Corbin leaned in, pale but focused. "Ellie, is that your name?" Ellie gave a single nod without turning around. "I don't mean to distract you," Linda continued, "but people back there are scared, and they think you're just some college kid from Maine." Ellie glanced at her briefly. "Tell them I'm FAA certified for dual-engine emergencies. Tell them I'm rated on Boeing 737 systems. And tell them that today, I'm the one who's landing this aircraft." Linda's breath caught. She nodded once and disappeared from view. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere was shifting. What had started as panic was becoming something else, uneasy silence. Word had spread quickly down the aisles. A quiet woman from row 17 was flying the plane. A young woman who didn't wear a uniform, didn't make a scene, just stood up and walked into the cockpit when no one else could. Passengers didn't speak now. They watched. Some clutched armrests, some prayed, some simply waited. In the tower at Wilmington International Airport, the controller was still processing what had come across the emergency channel. A woman's voice, not the crew's, had requested an emergency approach vector. She identified herself as Ellie Marchand, but no such name appeared in the airline's flight manifest. He keyed his mic. "Flight 704 Wilmington Tower. Please confirm name and qualifications of acting pilot. Repeat, confirm identity and training. We have no records for Marchand." There was a long pause on the line. Then another voice broke in, firm, commanding. Unmistakably military. This is Colonel Grant Halverson, United States Air Mobility Command. Ellie Marchand is a registered emergency override operator under FAA Directive TAC-12. She is qualified on Boeing 737 platforms and is authorized to assume command in case of crew incapacitation. You will give her full support. No further verification is necessary. The tower fell silent. Then the lead controller replied, Flight 74, you are cleared for immediate emergency vector. You have priority over all airspace. Say intentions. Ellie heard it in the cockpit and responded without hesitation, requesting glide approach into Wilmington. Runway 6. Confirm wind vector and elevation. Will execute deadstick landing. Need field cleared and crash crew on alert. Affirmative, the controller replied, voice steadier now. You are cleared for runway 6. Wind is calm. Field is yours. She turned to the captain, who had managed to sit up straighter. Start reading me the dead engine descent checklist. Skip anything marked inoperative due to electrical. We'll do this manually. He nodded and reached for the laminated backup card under the side panel. His hands shook less now. Ellie looked at the altimeter. They were at 23,000 feet, roughly 130 miles out from Wilmington. The descent profile would be tight, but possible if she kept a perfect glide slope and used every ounce of altitude. She adjusted the trim again, reducing drag without engine thrust. Every degree of error meant losing valuable distance. She leaned slightly to check the position of the rat and confirm voltage on the backup battery circuit. The instruments were stable, though minimal, just enough to fly. Her left hand stayed on the yoke. Her right moved between flap selectors, comm switches, and manual circuit breakers. It wasn't smooth, it was clinical. Each movement was deliberate. Each second mattered. Back in the cabin, passengers had begun to grasp what was happening. One man whispered, "She's really flying this thing." Another, older and quiet, simply said, "She's stabilizing it." The cabin crew now moved with a different energy, no longer frantic, but focused. They started preparing the cabin for a landing, removing loose items, securing bins, instructing passengers without panic. Linda stopped at row 17, now empty. She stared at the seat for a moment, then took a deep breath. She reached into the overhead bin, retrieved Ellie's carry-on bag, and zipped it shut. No one said a word. Back up front, Ellie was already beginning to angle the aircraft toward its glide path. She calculated the final turn radius using only visual estimation and remaining altitude. There were no computer aids, no flight director cues, just instinct, training, and memory. She spoke to the tower again. Wilmington, confirm field lights and emergency deployment. Confirmed, the controller answered. Field lit, crash units in position, fire and medical standing by. The captain was sweating again, but alert. You've done this before. Never in real life, Ellie admitted. But I've run it dozens of times in Level D simulators. That's the closest thing we've got. He stared at her. You taught people to do this. She nodded. Only the ones who wanted to be good at it. He almost smiled. Then, after a moment of quiet, he added, let me know when you want hands-on. I'm with you. Ellie didn't smile, but something in her voice softened. Copy that, Captain. At 14,000 feet, the ground began to appear through scattered cloud layers. A runway came into view, long, lit, and perfectly aligned. The final approach had begun. At 13,000 feet, the shape of the Carolina coastline was visible through the forward windshield. Wilmington's runways shimmered ahead, framed by a thin line of pine trees and coastal haze. It looked peaceful, but peace was far from what lived inside that cockpit. Ellie adjusted the yoke slightly, holding the aircraft steady. They were flying without thrust, descending purely by gravity and control surface manipulation. Every motion had consequences. Every second was part of a countdown. She glanced at the overhead panel. No change. No engine restart. The aircraft was still dead stick. That wasn't going to change. Captain Rourke had steadied himself. His color had returned, and he was reading from the laminated emergency card in clipped, clear tones. Approach phase. Checklist item 7, confirm landing gear extension readiness. Ellie nodded once. Hydraulics are sufficient. We'll extend gear on final. Manual release if we lose pressure. He continued. Flap configuration. Full flaps not possible. Ellie replied, we'll deploy partial at 1,000 feet. Any earlier and we risk glide loss. She was making the calculations in her head: airspeed, descent rate, altitude to distance ratio. At their current speed and angle, they had just enough margin to reach the threshold of runway 6, but only if nothing changed. No headwind, no sudden lift, no overcorrection. Wilmington Tower, Ellie called. Confirm runway 6 is cleared and all emergency units in position. The voice came back fast. Steady. Affirmative. Flight 704. Field is yours and no cross traffic. Winds calm. Crash units on standby. She leaned slightly to her right, checking visual reference points: tree lines, shoreline, road grids. Her body remembered this routine, not from real flights, but from simulators. Countless hours inside motion-based trainers. No do-overs, no resets, just crisis, response, resolve. Captain Rourke watched her hands. They moved like they belonged there. He didn't ask questions anymore. He simply followed her lead. In the passenger cabin, a heavy stillness had settled. The earlier tension had turned into quiet anticipation. No one was crying now. No one spoke. People stared forward, eyes locked on the cockpit door, some unaware they were holding their breath. At row 5, Linda Corbin gripped the jump seat straps. Her eyes flicked between the exit instructions and the overhead lights. She had flown nearly 800 commercial legs in her career. She had never seen anything like this. From behind her, a little boy whispered, "Is she still flying?" His mother hushed him gently. "Yes, sweetheart, she is." Ellie adjusted the trim again, subtly shifting weight distribution. The aircraft had begun to drift right. She compensated without thinking. Her mind was already focused on the final minute. They reached 7,000 feet. 6 minutes remained. "Captain," Ellie said, "we're nearing our turn to final." Rourke responded without hesitation. "Roger that. You want my hand on gear standby until I call it? We'll need perfect timing." She pushed the nose slightly down to gain airspeed. The aircraft responded with a shallow dip. It was a fine balance: too slow, they'd stall; too fast, they'd overshoot the field. At 5,200 feet, she pulled the nose level again. The runway lights had grown larger, clearer. Wilmington Tower broke in. "Flight 704, wind steady. You are number 1 for approach. Call short final." "Copy, Tower." Ellie replied, "Gear deploying in 30 seconds." She looked to the captain. "Now." Rourke flipped the gear lever, then reached for the manual override as the hydraulics shuddered. A clunk vibrated through the floor as the landing gear locked into place. "3 green," he confirmed. "We have gear." Ellie exhaled once, softly. Final flaps. She reached for the manual flap selector and dialed in 15 degrees. The aircraft responded with a slight pitch wobble. She countered instantly. "Speeds dropping to approach target. Trim holding." "Altitude," Rourke asked. "Just under 3,000. Final glide angle confirmed." They had one shot. Outside, emergency vehicles were aligned on both sides of the runway: trucks, ambulances, crash crews in suits, waiting. The tower reported all personnel clear. Back in the cabin, the quiet deepened. Passengers braced, hands joined, eyes closed. No one screamed. They knew the landing was happening now. At 1,800 feet, Ellie made her last major correction: small yaw adjustment to compensate for wind drift, then rolled gently onto final alignment. Runway 6 stretched ahead, lit like a runway in a textbook. She glanced at Rourke. Final call out. He read it calmly. Speed 134 knots. Glide angle stable. Gear confirmed. Partial flaps. No go-around available. Ellie nodded. We're committed. She adjusted the descent rate slightly nose down, then steady. At 800 feet, the edge of the runway approached fast. She held the yoke, both hands now, breathing controlled, shoulders loose, jaw firm. She didn't speak. She just flew. The wheels touched down at 124 knots. Center line perfect, vertical descent nearly zero. A puff of tire smoke trailed behind, but the touchdown was smooth, firm, but controlled. Ellie reached for the spoilers, deploying air brakes. No reverse thrust. She used aerodynamic drag and the wheel brakes alone, pressing down with controlled rhythm. The aircraft slowed 250 knots, 200, 180, 120. It rolled for nearly 2/3 of the runway. Finally, at the last exit point, it stopped. Absolute stillness followed. In the cockpit, Ellie set the parking brake, then removed her hands from the yoke and placed them on her lap. She turned to Rourke, who was still gripping his harness. He let out a breath and whispered, "That was textbook." Outside, flashing lights approached fast. The cabin doors were being unlocked by ground crews. Hoses were readied. Medics stood by. In the back, passengers began to cry, not in fear, but in relief. Quiet sobs, silent prayers. One man clapped once, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. Linda opened the forward cabin door and waved the fire chief inside. The chief, a stocky man in full gear, looked around the cockpit. His eyes landed on Ellie. "You the one who brought her in?" he asked. Ellie stood, her voice calm, level. "Yes, no injuries, none reported." He gave a slow nod, then simply said, "Damn fine work," before stepping out to oversee the evacuation. Rourke leaned against the wall, finally letting the adrenaline go. "You could have told me you were that good." Ellie didn't smile. It wouldn't have changed anything. He shook his head in disbelief. "Where'd they train you, little place in Arkansas?" she replied. "Taught me how to stay invisible until it mattered." Back in the passenger cabin, the aisle began to move slow, steady, like a ceremony. No shouting, no rush. People stepped off the aircraft into morning air, greeted by responders, not cameras. No one reached for Ellie. No one blocked her way. She waited until the last passenger had disembarked. Only then did she take her bag from Linda's hand and nod a quiet thanks. She stepped out of the aircraft alone. The wind was cool, the tarmac felt solid, and the sky behind her was still. When Ellie stepped onto the tarmac, there were already 3 news vans waiting at the perimeter. Reporters stood behind barricades, microphones raised, eyes searching, but they didn't recognize her. She wore no uniform, no badge. Her sweatshirt hood was pulled up, and her bag hung loose on one shoulder. She didn't wave. She didn't stop. A crew chief from the fire team opened the secure gate and gestured for her to pass. She walked through without a word, eyes down. The attention drifted to someone else, an airline manager, a police officer, a medic answering questions. No one asked Ellie for ID. No one blocked her path. By the time the first headlines hit the wires, unknown passenger lands plane. After crew collapse, she was already halfway to the airport hotel, checking in under her real name, paying with a card that left no military trace. She didn't turn on the television that night. She didn't need to. She had said everything she needed to say by flying. The next day, Pacific Meridian issued a public statement thanking an unidentified certified aviation professional for assisting in the safe recovery of Flight 704. The airline didn't name her. The FAA didn't issue a press release. The military didn't speak. But in certain closed forums, secure channels used by current and former aircrew, the name Ellie Marchand was quietly reintroduced. Not with fanfare, not with medals, just with 3 words. She did it. 7 days after the emergency landing, a plain envelope appeared at Ellie's apartment mailbox in Asheville, North Carolina. There was no return address, no postage, just her name, handwritten in clean block lettering. She knew before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. It bore the letterhead of the Air Mobility Command. Ellie, some pilots fly with license numbers. Some fly with clearance codes. You flew with something rarer, absolute certainty. You are cleared for any airspace, any conditions, any day. With respect, Colonel Grant Halverson, 139th Airlift Operations. She stared at the note for a moment, then folded it again and placed it in the back of a drawer. It didn't change anything, but it meant something. That was enough. She didn't respond. She never did. A week later, a reporter from a national aviation magazine emailed her personal account, asking for an exclusive interview. She deleted it. A producer from a streaming documentary company left a voicemail. She never called back. She had already chosen long ago she would never use her skills to become visible. The choice had been made 3 years earlier, on a moonless night near Kandahar. It was supposed to be a routine supply drop, 2 C-130s, 1 escort, a clear corridor in and out. Ellie was leading the formation, flying low under blackout. 10 minutes from the target zone, the second aircraft took a surface-to-air hit. No comms, no lights, just fire. She turned back against orders, flew beneath the burning fuselage, and forced a crippled glide path to the canyon floor. They saved 4 of the 11 crew. 7 didn't make it. When they touched down back at Bagram, someone from command tried to hand her a citation form. She declined. Then another. She declined again. By morning, her request for non-renewal of flight commission was already filed. She never told her family why she left, never said what happened. She just walked out of the hangar one day and never went back. That silence was, she discovered, had a weight, but it also had a freedom. And now, in the days following Flight 704, that same silence returned. Back in the aviation world, the story of the emergency landing began to take on a strange life of its own. Not in press conferences or documentaries, but in the quiet corners of pilot lounges and training centers. In Denver, a flight instructor paused his class before a simulator check ride and said, "If you ever doubt that you can land with nothing, go study what happened over Wilmington." In Houston, a maintenance supervisor downloaded the telemetry logs of Flight 704 and printed them out, highlighting the dead stick descent like it was poetry. In Seattle, a group of trainee flight attendants were told by their instructor, "There's one row we never question if someone asks to sit there. Just remember 17A. Ellie didn't know about most of that, but she did notice something unusual a few months later. She booked a personal trip Seattle to Minneapolis. When she checked in, she was surprised to see row 17A still available. Not blocked, not reserved, just open. She selected it without thinking. The same thing happened again 2 months later. Then again on a connector to Boise. One day, she asked a gate agent casually, "Is 17A ever pre-assigned?" The agent looked at the screen, then gave a faint shrug. "Not really. Seems to stay unclaimed until day of departure. System quirk. Maybe." Ellie didn't push. What she didn't know was that a few airline veterans, people who had worked long enough to remember, had quietly started a habit. If her name showed up in the manifest, they'd leave that seat open. Not as a rule, not as policy, just out of respect. Flight crews would see her name and offer her priority boarding. No explanation. Some would simply nod as she passed. Others wouldn't say a word. In the cockpit, if her voice came through on a private channel requesting clearance for a personal aircraft, ATC would grant her routing without delay. And at least once, a young pilot from Texas, on final approach into Chicago, thought of her when his instruments glitched during heavy turbulence. Later, he would say to a friend, "I just kept thinking if that woman from 704 could bring it down with nothing, I can hold this together for 20 more seconds." Ellie never heard that story, but it was one of dozens. By the end of that year, her name was known in every major operations center, never formally logged, never publicly cited, but always respected. She continued her work at the FAA quietly, training the next generation of pilots in simulated emergencies, unplugging engines, shutting off guidance systems, letting silence fill the cockpit while they tried to manage fear. She rarely spoke during those sessions. She just watched, took notes, and once in a while nodded. When asked what she thought of the Flight 704 incident, she always answered the same way. I did what anyone should do, if they're capable. And when someone tried to call her a hero, or legend, or exceptional, she would shake her head gently and say, I just didn't panic. But for those who understood what she did, those who knew what it takes to guide a 70-ton aircraft with no power, no backup, no second chances, her quiet presence became something else entirely. A benchmark. And row 17A, still empty flight after flight, was no longer just a seat. It was a silent reminder that somewhere in the sky, there are hands that don't need to be loud to be trusted.